Dear friends, welcome to another episode of The Informant. In this video, we're diving into Steadfast Noon, NATO's large-scale nuclear exercise held annually to ensure the alliance is prepared for any potential Russian nuclear threats. We'll also explore recent statements from Russia's leader, warning the West not to push the limits of his country. But before we get started, make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. NATO, under the leadership of its new Secretary General Mark Hutt, has launched its latest edition of the Steadfast Noon nuclear exercise. This two-week event involves around 2,000 military personnel and 60 aircraft from 13 nations, including bombers and fighters capable of carrying nuclear payloads. While this exercise has been an annual occurrence for over a decade, this year brings a new level of engagement, with Belgium and the Netherlands taking the lead. Naval and air resources are also being deployed on an unprecedented scale. Most of the maneuvers are happening about 900 kilometers from Russia in the North Sea, with Moscow being notified in advance of the drills. So why is NATO ramping up its nuclear preparedness now? Beyond the persistent Russian threats of nuclear action, another significant reason stems from Russia itself, specifically the complete overhaul of its nuclear doctrine announced by Vladimir Putin. The changes outlined by Putin are unsettling. Traditionally, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed the use of such weapons only in response to an existential threat to the Russian state. However, the new adjustments introduce three key shifts. First, Russia now considers any non-nuclear state's aggression, backed by a nuclear power, as a joint attack. Second, Russia is prepared to use nuclear weapons in response to air and space-based strikes that cross its borders, including non-nuclear drones. And third, nuclear weapons could be employed in response to conventional attacks that threaten Russian sovereignty, or even that of Belarus, Putin's close ally under dictator Alexander Lukashenko. These changes signal a potential lowering of the threshold for nuclear use, making it easier for Putin to justify deploying these devastating weapons. But why this shift? The war in Ukraine has placed Russia under immense pressure. Growing Western support for Kyiv, particularly the supply of long-range weapons, has weakened Moscow's deterrence. A prime example was Ukraine's missile strike on the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, using British Storm Shadow missiles. Moscow views this escalating military aid as a direct challenge to its red lines. Putin has frequently employed nuclear rhetoric to try to curtail Western involvement. But as we've seen in recent years, his threats don't always materialize. The West, led by the United States, has cautiously tested these red lines, being careful not to provoke an impulsive response from Moscow. Yet the steady increase in Western military aid to Ukraine and strikes on Russian-recognized territory have put Moscow's deterrent strategy in jeopardy. While the revised Russian doctrine seems to harden Putin's stance, the likelihood of an outright nuclear attack remains low. A more probable scenario involves an intensification of missile and drone strikes between Russia and Ukraine, along with increased Russian sabotage and covert operations within NATO territory, applying pressure without crossing the nuclear threshold. Another concerning factor is Ukraine's growing missile program, supported by the West. Next year, Kyiv's ballistic capabilities could pose a more severe threat to Moscow. In response, Russia might escalate, perhaps by arming anti-Western forces in the Middle East. NATO has already reported that Russia took a significant step in 2023 by deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus. While exact figures remain unclear, sources estimate that between 60 and 80 nuclear warheads have been transferred to Belarus, attached to Iskander missiles with a 500-kilometer range, capable of reaching most of Poland and the Baltic states from Belarusian soil. Amid this, Putin and other Russian leaders have consistently issued nuclear threats aimed at deterring the West from supporting Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil. Just last month, Putin warned that a conventional attack on Russian territory, supported by any nuclear power, would be considered a joint assault. The intent behind this threat is clear: to discourage the US and its allies from enabling Ukraine to use long-range weapons against Russia, which, according to Putin, could trigger a nuclear response. Despite this rhetoric, NATO reports no significant shifts in Moscow's nuclear posture. The primary goal of NATO's exercise is to reinforce the alliance's ability to respond to any nuclear threat against its 32 member countries. Angus Lapsley, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning, emphasized that while Russia remains the primary concern, the alliance is also closely monitoring China's rapid nuclear expansion, North Korea's weapons development, and Iran's nuclear advancements. NATO's focus remains on ensuring the credibility of its nuclear deterrence, with these exercises playing a crucial role in maintaining that any adversary takes this capability seriously. Although Putin continues using nuclear rhetoric to influence Western policy on Ukraine, NATO remains steadfast in its commitment to prevent such threats from dictating its defense strategy. In a world fraught with uncertainties, nuclear forces continue to play a central role in the defense strategies of both NATO and Russia. These exercises underline NATO's readiness to address any form of threat, especially as Russia ramps up its short- and medium-range nuclear capabilities. As Secretary General Mark Hutt pointed out, allowing Putin's threats to reshape NATO's defensive posture would set a dangerous precedent. On the other side, Vladimir Putin's recent remarks have caused waves worldwide. During a speech in St. Petersburg, he warned that Western supplies of long-range missiles to Ukraine would be viewed as NATO's direct involvement in the conflict. Putin asserted that this would fundamentally change the nature of the war. In October, both Putin and prominent Russian figures like Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and current deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, reiterated these warnings, telling the West not to test Russia's resolve on this matter. What exactly did Putin mean by this? To understand, we need to look back at the pattern of past threats. Since the war began in 2022, Russia has repeatedly drawn red lines regarding Western intervention. Yet the West has largely disregarded these warnings. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin issued a stark threat to any nation that interfered, promising unprecedented consequences, a statement widely interpreted as a veiled threat of nuclear war. Over the past 2 years, the West has supplied Ukraine with advanced missile systems and, more recently, F-16 jets, crossing multiple red lines Putin set. However, what makes these latest threats more alarming is the focus on long-range missiles, like the Storm Shadow, which have the range to strike targets up to 300 kilometers away. This capability puts critical Russian infrastructure within Kyiv's reach, including air bases launching daily attacks on Ukrainian cities and military positions. Putin claims that such an act would cross one of his red lines, potentially escalating the conflict to a new phase where Russia views NATO as an active combatant. But is this threat genuine, or just another attempt by Putin to exert psychological pressure on the West? International responses to Putin's threats have been mixed. Many European leaders have downplayed the severity of his remarks. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk brushed them off, calling them a sign of Moscow's desperation as it struggles on the battlefield. Tusk believes that Putin's aggressive rhetoric serves to distract from Russia's growing difficulties in achieving its strategic objectives. In the UK, the British Prime Minister adopted a more assertive tone, squarely blaming Russia for initiating the conflict. He emphasized that Ukraine is simply exercising its legitimate right to self-defense, and that Western military support is crucial to repelling Russia's invasion. While such statements are common among Western leaders, they conceal a more complex reality. How far is the West willing to risk a direct escalation with Russia? The US, on the other hand, has taken a more cautious approach. Despite continuing to provide Ukraine with advanced weapons, Washington places restrictions on how these systems are used. For instance, while the US has approved the delivery of advanced systems like ATACMS, it avoids authorizing their use for direct strikes on Russian soil. This indicates a real fear that such attacks could provoke a severe Russian retaliation. So why are long-range missiles so crucial for Ukraine and so concerning for Russia? These missiles allow Ukraine to target deep military installations within Russia that were previously out of reach, including ammunition depots, air bases, and logistics hubs vital to Russian operations in Ukraine. For Ukraine, these weapons are a way to level the playing field. Throughout the conflict, Russia's air superiority and missile dominance have been significant advantages, but with Western-supplied long-range weapons, Kyiv can not only defend itself better, but also strike critical nodes in Russia's military infrastructure. For Russia, however, this is an existential threat. As Putin mentioned in his speech, Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russian territory with Western-supplied long-range weapons is, in Moscow's view, tantamount to NATO's direct participation in the war. According to Putin, this would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict, introducing risks that could escalate rapidly. The central question remains: how far would Putin be willing to go in response to such attacks? Moscow's potential reactions are highly speculative, but Putin has given some clues in past speeches. He hinted that Russia might retaliate by expanding its arms supplies to the West's adversaries globally, suggesting that Moscow could arm insurgent groups or governments in direct conflict with Western interests and sparking new proxy wars. If long-range missiles begin hitting targets in Russia, the Kremlin's response could be swift and severe. However, there's also a chance that Putin may choose a path of restraint, focusing on fortifying Russia's defenses and continuing the war of attrition in Ukraine, which he did when previous Western red lines were crossed. We're undoubtedly in a moment of high tension. If the West continues to arm Ukraine with increasingly powerful weaponry, Putin's red lines may once again be tested. What remains to be seen is whether Russia's next move will be a strategic escalation, or if this nuclear rhetoric is simply a bargaining chip in an increasingly dangerous geopolitical game. If you value independent journalism and want to support our work, consider buying us a coffee through the QR code on the screen. Your contribution is essential for us to continue bringing quality analysis and information. Stay tuned for more updates, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for the latest analyses and insights on the world's most urgent geopolitical issues.